In elementary school, we used to pick a country every year as a class to study. I remember in the first grade, we studied Australia because there was Vegemite and things that were really gross, and it just kind of left an imprint on my mind. And then I also remember in the third grade, we studied Peru because I remember constructing this huge, replica of Machu Picchu out of construction paper. And ever since then, for the last 15 years, I have really wanted to visit both of those countries. Last month, I was fortunate enough to be able to check one of them off the bucket list when I visited Peru. I went to Peru with the McKnight Leadership Scholars Program. It is the program that really made me decide to come to Oklahoma State University because not only did it, reduce costs to in-state tuition levels and put me in this great group of people, but part of the deal is also that you get to go on a really, really reduced cost study abroad trip. And this year, my class decided to go to Peru. The goal, according to the program, is you're going to go study abroad. You're going to come back a better leader. I asked myself, and you may be asking the same question, how does going out of the country make you a better leader? And really the answer is, I don't really know, but here's what I can say. When you leave the country, you step into a very unfamiliar territory. When you visit another country, it opens doors to these experiences that are impossible to imagine. Now, they're probably not unbelievable, you'll believe they're true, but they're definitely far from predictable. They produce abstract lessons, things that can be applied to the rest of life, and they change your worldview. So before we get into the lessons, I'm not claiming to be a better leader because I visited Peru. Surely there are far better leaders out there in the United States who have never left the country or even their home state. But I am going to share 3 experiences from this Peru trip that changed my worldview a little bit. I hope you enjoy. I hope you find value in them. Let's get real. This first lesson is called Whatever It Takes. When I found out my class of scholars was going to Peru, I was really excited. Prior classes, I think the last 3 years, have visited Greece, Germany, and Zimbabwe, which is a pretty diverse group of countries. The European countries, they sound really fun, but visiting a developing country like Zimbabwe seemed just like a very much more valuable experience. And what I mean by that is by visiting a developing country, it is a big leap, especially if it's your first international experience, like it would be mine. So doing it with the full backing of a university, the insurance policy, the funding to make a really good itinerary, things like that, it turns the big leap of going to a developing country into a more manageable step. As an inexperienced American, I wasn't really sure what to expect from a developing country, especially in South America. Culture portrays it as 2 different things. On one hand, you get movies of, drug wars and these really crowded, rundown, poverty-stricken areas. And then on the other hand, you get Emperor's New Groove and Rio, the movie about the blue macaws, where it's this cultural haven, and maybe people are living on top of each other because it's, really dense population, but they have a lot of cool things going on. So I wasn't really sure what to expect. Before we left for the trip, we were told to, invest in filtered water bottles, expect upset stomachs from fruit, food, things like that. So I knew it wasn't going to be a total cakewalk, but I wasn't going to let the negative stereotypes close my mind because I wanted to experience Peru without assumptions. After a really long travel journey to get to Cusco, we finally arrived. We immediately got on a big old tour bus that would carry us 2 hours north to Ollantaytambo, which is a tourist town on the road to Machu Picchu. The bus, once we were all boarded, turned onto a tight city street that was lined with a bunch of small cars and a ton of people. And as soon as we turned onto the street, my eyes were just glued to the window, or what was beyond the window, because I knew this would be my first look at Peru that is actually Peru, not from an airport or, a tourist-heavy travel place. At first, it looked, not super out of the ordinary. It looked like a rundown American city. There were buildings that appeared to be well-used, probably pretty old, but still operated. Some of them had some graffiti. There were all kinds of people walking down the streets or standing. And from an American eyes, everything looked pretty used, pretty cheap, or both, but not crazy. The bus continued to maneuver up these really tight city streets as we began to leave the city center. As we got further away from the heart of Cusco, things began to look a little more like the movies. There were a lot of people dressed in worn-out clothes, tattered, torn, dirty clothes, selling everything from fabrics to bananas to used car parts. I realized that Peruvian pedestrian laws either don't exist at all or they just go unenforced, because the entire trip, like, this isn't something that I just saw in Cusco. Like, people walk within inches, like literally right next to these vehicles that are going 20, 30, 40 miles an hour without a care in the world. Along with the people in the streets, there were dogs everywhere. They looked like strays at first, but a tour guide ended up telling us that families feed them and they kind of have ownership of them, but during the daytime, they just kind of do whatever they want. It's survival of the fittest. The thing about Cusco is it sits in a fully developed valley. So the valley's huge. Just imagine really tall mountains. They're like 13,000 feet elevation with, big valley in the middle, but it's completely full of people, like no developable land left whatsoever. To get out of the city, that means that vehicles have to navigate all kinds of switchbacks, these really tight corners. They don't look like roads like that you would think of connecting a big city to the outer area, but they are, and you have to ascend them to get out of the population center. The best opportunity, though, in the area for income is the city. And even though it doesn't look like there's land that's available to be developed, people still do it. They build houses on the sides of mountains with these massive pitches. All the buildings in Cusco are pretty sketchy by American standards, but when you get to the outskirts of the city, they're on a different level, literally and metaphorically. They're built with everything from adobe to brick, tin, pretty much any materials that a family can get their hands on to build some kind of shelter. Almost none of them have windows. Almost none of them have exterior wood. And a tour guide said that running water and electricity is very rare on the outskirts of Cusco because there's no infrastructure to develop outwards. Eventually, we left the city behind and we found ourselves in some rural farmland, which was pretty familiar, so I took a minute to breathe. When I knew that I wasn't going to see anything super different from what I'm used to for a while, I pulled out a journal and just wrote everything I could possibly think of down that I'd just seen in Cusco. It would have been easy to judge my first look at Cusco and label, how people lived. The standard of living was definitely less than America's, but to straight up call the people, poor, label it as poverty, or say that they were unwise and just didn't know how to live, like that did not seem right at the time. So I just absorbed as much information as I possibly could and left the rest for further thought. And those thoughts, which I'm glad I left open, would become a lot more clear a few days later. On the third day of the journey, we woke up in Aguascalientes, which is the tourist staging town for Machu Picchu. It exists only for that reason. After a quick hotel breakfast, we walked about a quarter mile to some really big tour buses that would take us to see one of the 7 wonders of the world. We waited in line for like a quarter mile because you got to understand, like 1.5 million people visit this thing every year. The buses were really large. They fit a lot of people, but I still question to this day how the buses fit the drivers and their cojones, because the road to Machu Picchu, I've driven on some sketchy roads in my life, like around, cow pastures, everything. These roads were nuts. It was straight up a cliff, 180-degree switchbacks. The roads were only wide enough for one bus at a time, so these drivers would barrel up and down the roads until they met a bus. Then they would slam on their brakes and back up to the nearest wide spot. The craziest part was at the corners, when you would turn 180 degrees, like the bus has some overhang behind the back axle because it's a long bus. And when the driver would crank the wheel all the way one way, the back of the bus sometimes would literally hang over the edge of a cliff. It was sketchy, but we understood why would they do that once we reached the destination. Machu Picchu, if you don't know, is an ancient Inca city that is literally in the clouds. In 1911, there was a Yale researcher named Hiram Bingham who was searching for a city that had kind of only been described in legends and folklore. They thought it was an Incan holdout. Turns out it wasn't, but it did exist, and some locals showed him where it was. When he found it, it was pretty tattered in ruins, pretty grown over by trees and things, but today it's restored, preserved, and open for tourists almost year-round. Studies have shown that about 1,000 people lived there at the time at its height, and its main purpose was a retreat for the Incan ruler when the Incans were really on top of the world in their region. The other thing that tour guides told us was that even though it was just kind of a retreat, like it seems like it was a playground, it was also a pretty significant spot for things like architecture and astronomy and science. A lot of the temples had some pretty advanced astronomy, architecture for the time. And even in terms of religious things, if you turn a picture of Machu Picchu sideways, like counterclockwise, It'll look like a massive face in the mountain, which proves that there was a little bit more going on here for the Inca than just a retreat. If the Inca built Machu Picchu at the foot of the mountain, like where Aguas Calientes was, it would have been impressive. Like, the architecture would have been cool. But the surrounding geography is really what makes it a wonder of the world. Because the surrounding area is nothing short of just cliffs. Like, they're mountains by definition, but they're straight up and straight down. To grow food there, the Incans carved these massive terraces into about 100 vertical feet of mountain. And even though the terraces were huge, they didn't really feed the city completely. They had to bring supplies from Cusco, which were carried on hundreds of llamas across the Inca Trail, which is 40 miles long. And in the middle of that trail, you have to climb 13,000 feet of elevation. There's actually a marathon there today called the Inca Trail Marathon. And the first thing it says if you go to the website is a marathon in length and ultra marathon in effort, which I think speaks for itself. At first, like, when you get there, you think, what were the Inca doing? Like, you think they're out of their minds. Like, to build a sanctuary or a research center, really either way, on top of a mountain seems pretty crazy. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But then I thought back to Cusco and the residents who were building makeshift homes on the sides of mountains. Both structures, like, objectively terrible places to build. They lacked resources. They required a lot of work to make them livable. Both structures also enabled people to survive and thrive, though. Machu Picchu, even though it's up there and has some inconveniences, totally immune to floods, placed astronomers closer to the sky. And if you really needed a place to hide out, like, nobody's coming there to conquer you because it's so far up. The houses on the outskirts of Cusco, they were cheaper than buying a house in the middle of the city, and they put residents closer to jobs in the city. People do whatever it takes to get by in pursuit of prosperity. And I thought more about it. In the West, our ancestors did some pretty outlandish things in pursuit of prosperity. I know, for example, my great-great-grandpa and his family trailed his cows from the panhandle of Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl to Montana. It's a long ways. It would be more than you want to drive today in a car. But they did it in search of a better life, and they did what it took. Today, thankfully, we can't really imagine embarking on a journey like that. Instead, we just tell stories about the old pursuits. But we don't really realize around the world, people are still doing whatever it takes every day. So rather than judging the state of life in Peru and labeling it, I decided there's nothing I can do about it. I was there to observe, so I took what I could and got some inspiration out of it. I acknowledge today that many Americans struggle to get by. But you got to understand, the median Peruvian income is only, I think, $2,000 higher than America's poverty line. So it's totally different. Like, you're comparing apples and oranges there. America is relatively comfortable. Comfort is a blessing, but it really, when it arrived to the level that we have today, it kind of pushed the spirit of survival out of the American psyche. Seeing people do whatever it takes in Peru, building homes on the side of mountains, it unlocked this new feeling of humanity, and it hit me after I got home, really, as we'll see what that meant. I'm really glad that we fight obesity today rather than hunger. I'm really glad that we fight depression rather than E. coli and waste rather than scarcity. But I do wish that Americans could understand what it's like to do whatever it takes to survive. I'm not talking about, like, working somewhere you don't want to work. I'm not talking about selling some of your belongings. I'm talking about outlandish things to do whatever it takes to survive. I think if we understood that, we might relearn a little bit deeper sense of humanity and unlock new levels of grit. Lesson number 2 is called Climb Together. There's something deeply satisfying about summiting a peak. If you've noticed a trend in this podcast, it's that I talk about climbing peaks a lot because it's amazing. Like, burning legs, sticky sweat, and pumping lungs disappear with one final step when you make it to the top. When your body's aching, as soon as you get to the top, it begins to recover and your eyes take in the view. Your mind comes to a near stop as it dips into that soft fascination that we talked about in the first episode. Climbing a peak is the most natural, maybe the most primal form of gratification after physical effort that exists today. It's completely different than going to the gym and working out. And if you've done both, you understand why. After visiting the 102nd floor of the Empire State Building, I definitely know for sure now that views are better when they're earned instead of just, found. It's always worth the climb, especially when you do it with other people. Peru, if you didn't know, is home to the largest mountain range in the world, the Andes Mountains. Leaving Lima, which is on the coast, meant that we were leaving some of the only flat land in the country. Travel got really difficult from there, and sometimes it was treacherous, as we experienced going to Machu Picchu. Walking got a lot harder, not only thanks to the slope because we're in the mountains, but also the elevation. I don't think we went below 7,000 feet after we got to Cusco. Opportunities to summit peaks, though, became pretty frequent, and there were two intentional climbs with friends that really enriched my experience in Peru. The first came early, was not on the itinerary, and was totally unexpected. I mentioned Ollantaytambo. It's a small town en route to Machu Picchu. And in Ollantaytambo, Incan construction is literally everywhere. The Incan built all kinds of streets and homes that are still used by residents today, which is about 800 years later, depending on how you measure. Throughout the mountain town, Incan aqueducts, they just rush water downhill still to this day, exactly as they did back when they were built. The mountainsides, they're littered with everything from mined granite quarries to these massive terraces, food storage buildings, all kinds of stuff. It makes a lot of sense when you get there why the town is such an attraction, because it's all Incan based. We began touring Ollantaytambo early in the morning to avoid crowds. We left the hotel at I think like 7 a.m. The main ruins that you see when you get into town, they're massive, and they scale a mountainside. Stairs can guide visitors through, I wish I would have counted, it's hundreds and hundreds of vertical feet of terraces to a flat area with religious temples and all kinds of other things. There are trails, for those with the motivation, that can guide visitors a few hundred vertical feet higher to a lookout building. And that was on our itinerary. Made it up to the top of the steps, and then we made it to the trails and enjoyed what was supposed to be the final stop before descent. At the time, our tour guide Valentine had allotted about 20 minutes to rest at the top, because it was a pretty decent hike if you're not in shape to the top. Everybody, when we got there, took off their packs, found a rock, started talking to each other and sitting. They looked down in the valley below. They looked to enjoy it. I did not. I had spent the whole trail looking up to the next mountain. When we arrived at the final stop, I knew that there was one somewhat close by that I had my eyes set on. It was about a quarter mile away. The only difference is there was no trails there. It was only this, barely a path of woody shrubs and cactus. So I just cinched up my backpack that weighed about 20 pounds and power hiked for the top to the new final destination. After a few strides, I ended up using my hands to hold anything that wasn't spiny because it was straight up and down. Sweat had soaked my shirt where my backpack was restricting the airflow, and my heart rate, like it usually does on mountains, just skyrocketed to about 170 beats per minute. But finally, after long last, I took the final step. When I got there, two thoughts crossed my mind. The first was how unannounced I'd left the group. I realized I probably either looked like a madman, like I was running from something, or I looked like a jackass for ditching the group. Probably both. I turned to see a lot of small figures below just looking up, staring at me, and there were a few more that started to make their way up the slope. The second thought I had was how deceivingly low I was relative to the real peaks. There was a nearby mountain that stood at about 20,000 feet above sea level, which is seriously tall. And then the next highest peak was probably about 16,000 feet, which is a little more casual for Peru, but still pretty crazy. I was still higher than most, but not even close to the top. But nevertheless, I looked at the valley below, and as my mind started to drift into that soft fascination, I saw the most beautiful valley you could ever think of. Highly recommend going to the Substack for this one because there's a photo of it. Pretty breathtaking. Eventually, several others reached the top. Their lungs were torched, gasping for air, looking for whatever oxygen was available in the air at that high elevation. As they caught their breaths and took in the view, I realized, hey, I have some calories in my bag. I bet they'd appreciate this. So I pulled a bag of these little energy ball things. They're like oats and peanut butter and honey. Pulled them out of my backpack, gave one to everybody, and they all just like ravenously enjoyed it like they were starving. And after that, we just all sat for a moment and enjoyed the view. It was super special. Eventually, everyone stood for photos. I stayed to stay behind for a moment, though, collected my thoughts. The moment of reaching the top was pretty great, but the moment of breaking bread and enjoying a view together was a lot better. There was this sense of unspoken camaraderie that was forged from the hike and its rewards at the end. And when I realized that, I just made this pledge to myself, like the next time I spontaneously go to hike another summit, I'm going to at least ask somebody because it is worth it. The second climb of the trip was one, if not the highlight of the trip. It was a lot taller, it was a lot more dangerous, and it was definitely a lot more beautiful. Despite the challenge, nearly half the group was interested in the adventure, which I thought was pretty cool. This climb was to summit the world-famous Rainbow Mountain, known by the locals as Vinicunca. 14 McKnight scholars paid a fee of $40 each to sign up for the trip of a lifetime. It was 5 hours of treacherous roads, 3 miles of hiking, over 1,000 feet of elevation gain in that hike, and a view from 17,000 feet above sea level, which is probably, I hope not in my lifetime, but might be the highest I ever go in my life. What more could one ask for? Like, sounds awesome. We rose at 4 a.m. to load on a tour van at 4:30 a.m. Most of us immediately fell asleep, but I stayed awake as we bounced out through Cusco just to see what we were going to go by. And then when the sun came up, we were deep in the Andes Mountains, like way out of Cusco. At 6 a.m., we stopped for some breakfast, had some eggs, fruit, yogurt, and pancakes. And I thought it was kind of funny because when we got off the van, the tour guides were like, don't eat a lot. You're going to be at high elevation. If you get car sick on the way there or get elevation sickness once we get there, like, you're not going to want things in your stomach. We, like typical Americans, ignored all their advice and fueled pretty heavily. We had like 2 plates of food each because it was delicious, several cups of coffee. It was a lot of food and it was super good. And after we ate it, we got back on the van, hoping for the best as we went on the final leg of the drive. The view throughout the final segment of the van, it was really a reminder of the human drive to survive, that whatever it takes that I saw in Cusco and Machu Picchu. We went through a small town that quickly turned into some pretty desolate mountains. And through the rest of it, it was some small scattered villages, if you could call them that. What we mostly saw were herders trailing flocks of llamas across the mountainsides. And they looked like, kind of colorful Michelin men. They were wearing these really bulky layers of textiles, probably made from their own herds by hand, and it kept them insulated from the mountain environment. There were several herders in their flocks that were like thousands of feet above us, elevation-wise. Like, they were also thousands of feet away, but they were way up there on the mountains. And I realized the only way to get there for them was on foot. They hiked thousands of feet into the sky pretty much every day to take care of their sheep. We reached the base of Vinicunca after 2 hours of observing the Peruvian countryside through a window. Dozens of vans were parked there. It's a huge tourist attraction. A lot of their passengers were already on the trail. Our tour guides gave us some final advice. Pretty simple. They said, be at the top by 10:30 and don't pass out from elevation. When you're at that elevation, it's really easy to underestimate how fatigued you are. And it's really easy to be like, oh, no, it's fine, I can keep going. But you literally don't have oxygen. So they had it available if there was an emergency like that. Strapped on my backpack, waited for the rest of the group to unload, and we hit the trail. It was what we were there for. The first stretch of the trail was pretty flat, like high elevation. You could tell that the air was thin. You're breathing heavier than you would have been otherwise. But it was possible to hold a pretty quick pace. So after a few short minutes, the trail went totally vertical, like straight up. In the front of the pack were Kelton Turner, Tatum Kennedy, Cade Pearson, and I. We trudged the slope until like our lungs were just torched, legs were burning, couldn't go anymore. And at the time, like when you get to that point and how fatigued your body is, you're like, man, we must have just covered some ground. That felt impressive. We looked back and realized we'd only traveled maybe 100 yards tops, not very far. The rest of the group was spread out below us. Kelton, Tatum, and Kennedy and I, we all grew up at some pretty high elevation in Oregon and Colorado. Cade and his family grew up in Texas, so they didn't grow up in the elevation, but they spent a lot of vacations hiking these 14,000 foot peaks in Colorado. So our bodies were adapted to it, but everybody else pretty much grew up in the lowlands of the American plains or the South. Our bodies also spent a lot of time there recently, but they also had some memory on how to handle elevation, which was super nice. We continued to make our way up the mountain. We ended up taking these short, frequent breaks, which allowed us to stay together. About 3/4 of the way to the top, a few of us were getting pretty lightheaded. Not to the point of being dangerous, but we were like, if we want to make it in time, we should probably do something different. So they all had backpacks on. They had water and all kinds of other stuff. One member of our group, Jack, he had 50 pounds of camera gear on his back because he was filming a documentary about the trip. And we didn't know how heavy it was until we got up there, and I was like, man, let me feel that bag. And it was way heavier than my ruck pack would be for training. So Kelton and I, we had some small backpacks. We took some of their things, water, camera gear, made sure that everybody was good, got water, and kept going up the mountain. At 10:10 a.m., 20 minutes before we were supposed to reach our destination, the 4 group leaders took the final step. We looked around to see this striped mineral deposit, which made the famous Rainbow Mountain name. We saw this sprawling valley below just covered in red and a massive glacier high in the distance. It was breathtaking, probably the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. By 10:25 a.m., 5 minutes before the deadline, the rest of the group was taking their final steps to the top. There was one of our friends who hadn't reached the top. She was one of the ones who was struggling a little bit. She'd chosen a little bit more longer, gradual route, and it was good. Like, I'm glad she took that way, but we only had a minute or two to enjoy the view and capture a group photo. At 10:29, we were pretty worried she wasn't going to make it. It was our turn to take our group photo. We didn't know if she was going to make it, and then right when the clock struck 10:30, she took her final step, fist pumped, and joined us for the group photo. We all cheered in celebration. It was a fantastic moment. If you want to see what it looked like, you can go on the Substack and see the picture that we took at the top. Awesome, awesome time. We eventually made our way down the slope to board the van. Once we were there, everybody fell asleep super fast. It wasn't that far of a hike, and like realistically, if you made that hike at a normal elevation, like elevation gain and everything involved, it wouldn't have been that bad. But at 17,000 feet, your body is just under so much stress, whether you know it or not. So everybody was exhausted. When we returned to the hotel, we all, I think, said the same exact thing almost at the same time without planning it. We were like, that is some of the best $40 we've ever spent. The view and the elevation were incredible, but the moment our entire group united at the summit at that 10:30 a.m. mark, that's what made the adventure a success. We climbed it together. This last lesson for Peru is called Be Grateful. I want to preface this. If it feels like I'm downplaying the problems we have in America, I promise you I understand how grave they are. I understand how people are struggling. Not everybody has it great in America. But like I mentioned earlier, you got to understand, like the difference between a country like America and a Peru is like comparing apples and oranges. Everything has their problems, but ours are significantly easier to get through to deal with. So with that, this is Be Grateful. At least once every year, there's a famous person, whether it's at an award show, celebrity, politician, somebody, and they say the sentence, America is the greatest country on earth. What happens after that is two things. They're met with praise and skepticism alike. Praisers point to the ideas in our founding documents, American influence globally, income, things like that. The skeptics, on the other hand, point to things like high healthcare costs, income inequality, inner cities, all the above. So the question is like, who is right? The answer, what I learned, is nobody, because it literally doesn't matter. Unfortunately, our political climate has us thinking about these arbitrary battles, when instead I think we should be grateful for what we have and focus on what we can improve. Traveling back to Stillwater took 26 hours. It was crazy. We flew all afternoon, and then we flew all night, and then we ran to catch a plane in Miami, and then we flew even more from Dallas to Stillwater. By the time we touched down in Oklahoma, we were literally like just at our ends with it. It's not even like things went bad. We were just so exhausted from being on a plane. We stumbled off looking like smiling zombies. The hot Oklahoma air and wind, I typically do not love it, but that day I was like, this feels right. I looked out at the flat land and was just happy to be out of the mountains, something I probably will never feel again in my life, I hope. Concluding a 26-hour travel marathon, like that was reason enough to be excited, but I later realized that that wasn't why we were excited in that moment. After retrieving my bags, said goodbye to everybody, went to my pickup. When I turned the key, it started. Cold air began to blow from the vents. Music played from the speakers. In less than 5 minutes, I was in Walmart. I bought a rotisserie chicken, power greens, whole wheat bagels, eggs, banana, yogurt, a few other things. The grocery store trip cost me like $30, 10 minutes. It was going to feed me for the next 3 days before I took off on the next adventure. Then in less than 5 minutes, I was home. I was filling my water bottle from a freshly stocked fridge. There was a warm shower. It was quiet. It was comfortable. It was awesome. The thing about Peru is there was not a single inconvenience that made Peru hard to handle or would make me say I'm never going back there. But the thing is, there were a lot of inconveniences. Water had to come from a filter bottle or a bottle that you purchased. Food had, I will say, higher nutritional value because it wasn't processed, but literally no safety guarantee. About half the group had GI issues by the end of the trip. The rooms and the showers, like, they were shelter, but they had primitive climate control, if any. Peruvian roads were well maintained, but pretty inefficient because they exist in the mountains. When I returned home, I realized how much we take our country for granted. It does not matter if we're the greatest country in the world. Every country has problems, but ours, in general, allows us to live pretty good lives. Like, America does have big problems. Cities like Los Angeles and Portland have tens of thousands of homeless people. Our education system lags behind the rest of the developed world. Healthcare here is outrageously expensive. We have a mental health and chronic disease problem, but the vast majority of people have food, water, and shelter. Nobody's forced to build makeshift homes for their families on the sides of mountains to survive. More importantly, the majority of Americans couldn't even imagine doing something like that. They would refuse. 87% of Americans receive a high school education. Healthcare is expensive, but it does exist. Thinking about all this, too many of us focus on the luxuries we don't have rather than the essentials we do. There's this thing my 5th grade teacher, Mr. Fritz, once said. He said, there are pros and cons to everything. Super simple, pretty obvious statement, but something about it in the 5th grade has stuck with me until I wrote this Substack, and it held true. Every place has pros and cons, and no place exists in a vacuum outside of everything else. To pretend a place can be better or worse than another place, like holistically, is probably true, like it can be to a point, but to even make the comparison and focus on it is pretty naive. On top of that, to pretend America exists in a world that can be rid of all problems is pretty selfish. America is unique in many ways, but we are not so cool that we can escape the imperfection of human creation. Returning from Peru, it really just taught me to be grateful for the aggregate of what I have. Like, sure, be grateful for a lot of little things, the essentials, but the whole picture is vastly different from what I experienced in South America. We can admire the positive aspects of other nations and their cultures and appreciate home at the same time. Contrarily, we can recognize the downsides of other nations and their cultures while also criticizing the downfalls of America. It's not to say that we can't do both things at the same time is a false binary that I think we get caught up in a lot in our culture today. And I know after returning that I have a relatively good life, whether America is the greatest country in the world or not. And if you're reading this, if you're listening to this, you probably do too. If you haven't heard this quote, it's pretty cliche, so you might have, but comparison is the thief of joy. When we focus on arbitrary battles about what's better and what's worse, it takes away from our ability to be grateful. Remember that there are pros and cons to everywhere and everything. So instead of spending time making arbitrary comparisons, be grateful for the things you have. This Substack was inspired by a few things. The first one is Jace Johnson Salmonella. Poor guy in our group got pretty much poisoned by something. We're not sure what it was, but he survived and he made it on the plane, so that's good. Cusco Brewing Company's barley wine and the lovely family that served us more than we needed. Celebrated my 21st in Peru. Pretty good time. On a more serious note, there were 2 tour guides that really taught us a lot. The first one name was Jorge. He was one of the few guides who really didn't romanticize or demonize Incan and or Spanish culture. And I think what he showed me is that we can take pride in our homes as they are, not as we wish them to be. There was a lot of stuff in Peru that was very like touristy, or like they propped up the Incans as these like only peaceful civilization people that never conquered anybody or killed people if they didn't follow their way. And there were also a lot of people who said the Spanish were these conquerors and talked about how powerful they were. Jorge was super, super objective about it, which I really appreciated. The second tour guide's name was Valentine. I call him in here Valentine the Adventurer. Out of all of the tour guides, Valentine was hands down the most fun. There were several occasions where he promised, including to his fellow tour guides, he's like, yep, this is going to be an easy hike, not too bad. And then we would start hiking and he would just like take off sprinting up or down the mountain and we would chase him like crazy people. So fun. This episode is also inspired by 2 morning runs that I took in Cusco. When I first arrived in Cusco, like I talked about, there was just this feeling of like, ooh, I don't know if I want to spend a lot of time here. Like it was just kind of startling. By the time we'd spent probably 3 or 4 days there, I'd kind of gotten accustomed. I was like, I'm here once. This is the only opportunity I'm going to have to do something like this. So I ran up to the edge of the valley to a little statue, well, a pretty big statue called Cristo Blanco. It's kind of like Christ the Redeemer, but smaller. And it was so fun. I can't describe to you how awesome it was, especially on the first one when I did it with a couple other people. Super difficult, but very worth it. And it goes to this trend, kind of like climbing the mountains, that I think I probably sound like I'm beating a dead horse, but man, being in good shape and being healthy made this trip so much better. I can't imagine if I would have went to Peru and I would have been around all these mountains, around all these opportunities for views, and thought to myself like, man, it is so hard to get up there that I can't do it. Like that would have been a massive letdown. So with that, here's my final advice. If you ever get the chance to go to Peru, or to be fair, like any other country kind of like it, get ready. You're not going to feel comfortable all the time. You're not going to have the luxuries and the amenities that we do have in America. But when you get back to the States, after hopefully living life to the fullest for the time you were there, you won't regret it. You'll be in a country that you realize you should be more grateful for. You will have all kinds of experiences that shaped your views of the world, and I think you'll be really motivated to go do good things in the place that we live. With that, thank you for listening. My goal with this podcast is not to tell you why you should get better in your life, but rather I want to make you feel like you want to get better. And I hope this podcast has done that for you. I hope you found some wisdom in these lessons from Peru. Catch you in the next one. Let's get real.